Alright guys, so in this video I wanted to talk about the papillary layer in the dermis. So if this is your epidermis over here, only draw part of it, the lower part of it. This is just a segment of it, right? You can imagine if it's like from the skin of someone's hand, we were just taking this segment. This upper part would be the epidermis, right? And this lower part is going to be the dermis. Okay, so this is the dermis. Now, this dermis is going to consist of two different layers. The first is called the papillary layer. Papillary layer. The second is called the reticular layer. Reticular layer. Okay. So this is your epidermis, just to make it clear, and then this is your dermis. Okay. Now to start, we're actually going to talk about a bit about the epidermis because it's important to the skin as a whole. So this epidermis, the lower cells of the epidermis, so I'll just redraw this, right? So the dermis and the epidermis are actually going to be connected at this sort of wavy area. You can see that parts of the dermis are actually overlapping with the epidermis. So the epidermis is sort of coming into the dermis is kind of coming into the epidermis area. And there are names for these two things. So over here on the dermis side, these are called dermal papillae. Dermal papillae. And on the epidermis side, these are called epidermal ridges. So those are the names of the sort of lumps that are kind of coming in to the other part of the skin. Okay, now near this layer on the epidermal side, the lower cells in this area, so I'll draw the lower cells of the epidermis. There are going to be hemidesmosomes. So I'll zoom in. Okay, so these are the cells, the lower cells. There are going to be things called hemidesmosomes. I'll write it out, hemidesmosomes. And these hemidesmosomes are going to, Alexa, stop, anchor these lower cells to something called the basal lamina. So I'll just draw this line to represent the basal lamina. And the basal lamina, something beneath these lower cells, right? So I'll draw it on the big picture. Just like that. So they're going to be underneath, it's going to be underneath these lower cells, and these hemidesmosomes are going to attach these cells to this basal lamina, and it's going to keep these cells, this lower cells of the epidermis, anchored in place, or it's going to help to keep them in place. So that's hemidesmosomes and how the epidermis, well, part of the reason the epidermis stays in place and is anchored to the same place relative to the dermis. Okay, next, let's talk about dermal ridges. So there are dermal papillae and epidermal ridges. If we look at them from a bird's eye perspective, it might look something like this. I'm doing my best to draw it. Okay. And these are this is the dermal side, so this is the dermis, and then above it would be the epidermis. And we're kind of looking at it like the epidermis isn't there. We can see through the epidermis, and we're looking at this sort of layer. Okay. Now, over here, I'm not drawing it on this perspective because it's kind of hard to visualize, but there are going to be things called dermal ridges. These dermal ridges are actually going to look like ridges from the bird's eye view perspective. So they're kind of like this. And they're going, and when you look at it from the outside, so someone's fingertip, for example, you're going to be able to see them. We'll see where they are, because where the ridges of your fingerprints are, that's where your dermal ridges are. Your dermal ridges are sort of going to move, are going to pop out sort of, or pop your skin out a little bit. So you're going to be able to see where those dermal ridges are from the outside of your skin, like on your fingerprint. So these dermal ridges are going to be in your dermis, and they're going to sort of pop out like these long lines, these long parallel lines, and they're going to make things on the outside present. So like fingerprints. Fingerprints are just dermal ridges, or they're the result of dermal ridges. So those are dermal ridges. Okay. Next, well, now we're actually able to talk about the papillary layer. So the papillary layer is the upmost part of your dermis, right? This is your papillary layer, this area over here. It contains several things. First, we're going to talk about is our phagocytes, and we're not going to be talking about them much in this video because they're part of the immune system, but we will talk about them in the future. So phagocytes. Right here. And phagocytes are going to be in your papillary layer, and they're part of the immune system. So we won't talk about them too much, but just know that they are present, that they are there. Okay, next, let's talk about fibroblasts. There are also going to be fibroblasts in your papillary layer. And fibroblasts are going to produce the things required to make things like collagen fibers. It's going to produce the things and excrete the things required for collagen fibers and like elastic fibers. And these are things that contribute to the sort of structure of the papillary layer. And these collagen fibers and the collagen fibers are going to bring structure to the papillary layer, and the elastic fibers are going to bring elasticity to the papillary layer. Right? Yeah. Keep in mind that these fibers are actually going to be thinner than the fibers in the reticular layer, and I'll talk more about that when I'm talking about the reticular layer in the next video. But just know that there are these collagen fibers and elastic fibers. Okay. Next, let's talk about the blood flow in your papillary layers. So there is going to be blood flow in your dermis as a whole. And this blood flow is actually going to provide blood for both your dermis and your epidermis, because you can imagine the cells in your epidermis also need blood flow. You're also going to have corpuscles, known as Meissner corpuscles, in your dermal papillae. you are also going to have things called Meissner's corpuscles in your dermal papillae. So I'll draw one, this kind of. And this is the nerve processes. Okay. Actually, that doesn't make it a little bit better. Okay. And these Meissner corpuscles are basically just nerve endings. And these nerve endings are going to, well, these nerve endings in particular, these Meissner's corpuscles, are going to detect light touch. So if you were lightly touched, then these Meissner's corpuscles would detect that. Yeah, so Meissner's corpuscles are going to be in your dermal papillae. You're also just going to have nerve processes on their own in your papillary layer and your dermis as a whole. So there are going to be nerve processes going through your dermis, and they're actually going to be leading to both Merkel cells in your epidermis, as well as free nerve endings in your epidermis. And free nerve endings terminate, or they end, in the granulosum. So, and they detect things like touch, cold, heat, and a variety of other things. But they're in your epidermis. They're called free nerve endings because, unlike these Meissner's corpuscles and corpuscles that we're going to be talking about when we talk about the reticular layer, they're not suspended in any form of connective tissue. So there's connective tissue in your dermis, as you know, because there is collagen fibers, elastic fibers that make up that connective tissue. Okay, so that pretty much concludes this video on the papillary layer. In the next video, we're going to be talking about the reticular layer. Thank you.